As more countries join in the fight against COVID-19, what role are the United Nations and its specialized agencies playing? In a recent letter addressed to Chinese President Xi Jinping, the administrator of the United Nations Development Program, or UNDP, Achim Steiner, expressed the agency's support for China, saying it will stand firmly with the government and the people of China in this crucial time. For more details, I'm pleased to be joined via Skype by Ms. Beate Trankmann, the UNDP resident representative in China. Ms. Trankmann, thank you so much for joining us. First of all, how do you assess the epidemic situation at this moment now?
Well, I think we're seeing very encouraging progress in China, thanks to the very concerted measures that the government has taken across all levels. And I think in particular the effort by the health and emergency personnel in Wuhan and Hubei is absolutely admirable and deserves the gratitude of the Chinese people, but also the world, because I think because of these very concerted efforts, we are seeing the epidemic leveling off in China. We're seeing less new infections. On 1st of March, we had the lowest number, only 200 new cases since the end of January. And I think the fact that China has cooperated so closely with WHO on understanding the virus, decoding it, and also designing measures has helped both China and the world. One thing I think that is interesting in the Chinese response is also the use of technology that we're seeing. The use of AI, for example, for diagnostics, which helps to process CT scans much more quickly, but also the use of online doctors, dispatch of medicine through online, so people don't have to go into hospitals. And also the delivery of food, for example, at hospitals in the isolation wards through robots. So there's a lot to learn, actually, from the Chinese response.
I mentioned this letter that was written by Mr. Steiner as the head of the UNDP to Chinese President Xi Jinping. In the letter, it said that the UNDP and the United Nations system stand firmly with the government and the people of China during this critical time. UNDP country office in Beijing is in close touch with relevant authorities to provide emergency support and assist with the procurement of critical medical supplies. So, first of all, why the necessity of such a letter, and what are the central ideas that your agency wanted to convey through such a letter?
I think we wanted to convey support from the United Nations development programs from the highest level downwards. And we are, as the development actor of the United Nations, serving the poorest and the most vulnerable. I wanted to make sure that we, as part of the wider UN system response in China, also make our contribution. So in an initial stage, and I think that has been communicated by the administrator, we facilitated the supply of, or the procurement of supplies of urgently required medical equipment, ventilators, patient monitoring systems. We had a first batch that was handed over to Ministry of Commerce on 12th of February. And we also facilitated international procurement of protective suits for the frontline health workers. As you know, these suits have been in short supply worldwide. So we had a first batch arriving, 2 batches actually arriving just last week and over the weekend, and another one coming in soon, and that is being handed over to the Red Cross. for distribution to hospitals in Beijing and Hubei. We also wanted to make sure in our response that we really reach the furthest behind. And some of these populations are ethnic minorities, are people who don't necessarily, in the older generations, speak Mandarin that well, read Mandarin that well, but it's still very important for them to have access to information, how they can protect themselves and their communities from the virus. So we started a social media online campaign called Spread the Word, Not the Virus, where we have messages. We collaborated with WHO, so the good health practice messages and information on the virus based on WHO materials, translated into 12+ dialect languages. And disseminating this information. And that has proven to be very popular. I think we have 27 million views of this by now.
How do you assess the need of China, however, of the protective suits, for instance, or other materials that you were mentioning? Because on the one hand, China is in great need of these materials, but on the other hand, China is also a big manufacturing country, and the capacity for manufacturing these protective suits or masks are also catching up. So how do you assess how much is needed? And let us not forget there are a surging need around the world as countries are also stepping up their protection against this virus. How does the UNDP coordinate the resources then?
Absolutely. I think that's a very good question. And I think this was a need that was very urgent and quite vital in the early stage of the response. Also because, of course, with the extension of the Chinese New Year holidays, there was a lot of factories still closed. Production levels were not at normal capacity. But now that we're seeing people returning or workers returning to work and production is picking up, I think this need, and domestic production in China is picking up of these type of medical supplies. I think there is it's now time where these procurements can be done domestically. So that was at the very initial stage of the response. But I think globally we're seeing these stockouts to continue, and actually given that China is more advanced than most other countries by now in the response, and but the virus is spreading, we're also, as UNDP, through the network of our global network of our offices, collaborating with offices, our office in Iran, for example, other offices who have a need of supplies to support them with expertise and facilitate these international procurements.
According to data from the World Health Organization, as of March the 3rd, the virus has spread to 73 countries, including China, around the world. So, in your opinion, how should countries, or how could countries better cooperate, and what role can agencies such as the UNDP play in promoting such cooperation?
Well, I think global solidarity on this is absolutely vital. The virus obviously transcends borders and political lines, and I think it's very important that internationally we join ranks and we join forces and that we learn from each other. I think China has a crucial role to play there with the knowledge that the country has gathered in the response so far, to share this. But of course we're also looking at impacts beyond just the health emergency response. And again, there's things to learn, and UNDP, I think, with our global platforms and networks of offices in virtually all countries in the world, we can bring people together from different schools of expertise to develop comprehensive responses against this spreading epidemic, especially also in countries that have weaker health systems than China has.
Do you foresee, beyond the short-term public health crisis, any longer-term impact on a global scale in terms of sustainable development goals? And who might be most affected by the negative consequences?
I think the answer to that question is actually twofold. I think we're seeing an effect in China already, and we're likely to also see an effect around the globe. In China, I think we know already a little bit more, because in China this has been going on for a little longer. Mm-hmm. But I think what is for certain is that the poorest and the most vulnerable will be affected most, because they have no coping mechanisms, no financial buffers to fall back on. Local economies are down. SMEs are suffering, of course, by the reduction in trade. We were looking just over the last few days at a survey from Peking University serving around 3,000 SMEs, and one of the indications was that they were saying that they only had cash resources to keep them going for 2 more months. Mm-hmm. So with a prolonged effect, that would have impact on local economies. Globally, of course, China is so much more interlinked into the global economy that there will be spillover effects. And the question is all about how long will the spread continue now also outside China, because that will undoubtedly affect global value chains, many of which are going right through China.
Right. Finally, 2020 is a very critical year for China in terms of achieving its poverty reduction goals. The UNDP once praised China for making historical achievements in poverty eradication. So do you foresee any obstacle in meeting this goal created by the virus?
Well, I think so far China is still on track, and this is indeed a historical achievement, lifting 750 million out of poverty. China is looking at eradicating absolute poverty by the end of the year. So there is another 17 million. Many of these people are actually in the vulnerable groups, either elderly or people with disabilities or people who have an illness, who are very much, of course, also affected by the crisis. And I think what we're trying to understand is how we can build the resilience together with the national authorities of these affected populations, so that they can achieve the goal of lifting everyone out of poverty, leaving no one behind, but also making sure that people who are just above the poverty line because of the effect of the crisis on local economies don't slide back. And we're looking at gathering data for that together with the national authorities to develop targeted responses for the most vulnerable and the poorest households.
Thank you so much to Ms. Beate Trankmann, the UNDP resident representative in China.